So I'm actually really interested and curious about H.P. Lovecraft adaptations on film. I think it's a really interesting little subgenre of horror, and I just checked out the Dunwich Horror from 1970. I thought it was a really interesting movie. I'm excited to talk to you about it today. Welcome to the Cobwebs channel, everyone. My name is Daniel. So this is one of 3 Lovecraft adaptations that American International Pictures made back in the day, and this is actually the last one. The first one is called The Haunted Palace. I've got it in this Vincent Price collection because it is a Vincent Price movie, and actually they marketed it as an Edgar Allan Poe adaptation because Poe movies with Vincent Price were really big during this time period, 1963, but it's really based on H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, and it's really credited as the first major motion picture to feature those Lovecraft concepts like the cosmic gods and the Necronomicon and all kinds of stuff like that, and I think it's a really cool movie. I'm a big fan of it. Then in 1965, they made Die Monster Die with Boris Karloff, which is based on Lovecraft's The Color Out of Space. And I've only seen this movie once. I was actually not a big fan of it. I found it pretty disappointing, especially since I love the 2019 or 2020 version of Color Out of Space with Nicolas Cage, which is a fantastic movie. Just some of the coolest Lovecraft imagery you can possibly, and ideas you could possibly get in a movie. But I need to give Die Monster Die another shot. But I was really excited to watch the Dunwich Horror, and I gotta say, it did not disappoint. So the movie's about a guy named Wilbur Whateley, who's this mysterious young man who travels to a library in Arkam, which holds the only remaining copy of the Necronomicon. He really hopes to be able to obtain this book because he truly believes in the Old Ones, which are a extra-dimensional race of people / possibly gods, and the Necronomicon has a lot of information about them, their history, and possibly how they can be brought back. A young woman played by Sandra Dee falls under his influence and travels back to his home in Dunwich, where he might be trying to use her in an occult ritual. So what did I like about this movie? First of all, the story. I was really interested in the story of this movie. Now, it's one of those movies that has a lot of big ideas and often doesn't have a good way to really communicate them to you other than have characters kind of talk about them. It's really a movie that's not very good at the show don't tell concept of filmmaking for sure, but I found the ideas on display here so interesting. Now, I've never read the Dunwich Horror. I'm actually not a big Lovecraft reader, but I'm really interested in Lovecraft movies. I've watched a ton of them. And this movie just has so many iconic aspects of Lovecraft. Dunwich, which a lot of movies, not even Lovecraft adaptations, have taken that name. Like Fulci's City of the Living Dead takes a lot of Lovecraft ideas, including Dunwich, also the City of Arkam, Dr. Armitage, and of course, the Necronomicon. Now, if you don't know what the Necronomicon is, it is a fictional book that H.P. Lovecraft made up, which is basically a grimoire, an ancient textbook of magic and the occult, and has a lot of information about the Old Ones, their history, what they are, and how they can be brought back.
The Old Ones walked, serene and primal, undimensioned and unseen. The Old Ones broke through of old, and they shall break through.
Now, the Old Ones can be gods, cosmic gods, things like that. This movie really describes them as a extraordinary race of people from another dimension, a kind of being that was here before us and will be here after us. And if they can be brought back to our dimension, it will mean the end of humanity. And I just thought that was such a fascinating concept to center a horror movie around. I've heard this movie described as kind of slow and boring, and that's why I know it's definitely not a movie for everyone. It might not be for you, but I just thought everything they were talking about in this movie was so interesting.
When the seasons and the cycles of the moon were ripe, then they came, one by one, and gathered among these stones.
And I was really interested in Wilbur, who is played by Dean Stockwell. Dean Stockwell, I mean, he's had a long career. He was a child actor before this movie, but I primarily know him as Al from Quantum Leap, hanging out with Scott Bakula.
How was the girl of my dreams.
That will always be Dean Stockwell to me.
Personally, I'd rather be in Vegas.
But it was cool to see him in this. And I was really glad that he was cast as Wilbur and not one of the major horror legends of this time, like Vincent Price, who would have been way too old at this time, but I don't think that would have stopped them if they could have gotten him for this movie or something like that. But Dean Stockwell just brought such a contemporary edge to this movie that I thought worked really well with it. I could see a lot of people calling him monotone, kind of boring, but I thought he was just so effective at being this weird off-kilter guy, this guy who's from this small town, Dunwich, who both he and his family are obsessed with the idea of the old ones. It's a religion to them. He describes himself as a student of the occult, and his whole life is building up to him being able to do a ritual to summon them. So I thought his performance was so effective in that way. They also take the direction with him that he is actually charming and attractive and alluring, not like a creepy old guy like some of the horror legends might have played. And, you know, it's almost a little bit unbelievable to see Dean Stockwell as attractive in this, since he looks so completely dated with the big curly hair and the big old mustache.
I'd really like to glance through that book, the Necronomicon.
Easy to see why you two girls were so effectively charmed. I'm very glad to have met this young man.
I don't know. Let me know down in the comments below if you find Dean Stockwell attractive in this movie. I guess I wouldn't really know. You know, he is clearly the villain of the movie, but still, as the movie was going, I wasn't quite sure how the movie was going to frame him, because sometimes he is charming in a way that you like him. Sometimes he is sympathetic. The townspeople of Dunwich really hate him, and they come across as really bigoted. They come across like the angry townspeople chasing down Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, and you feel bad for Frankenstein. There's a great feature on this Arrow Video Blu-ray, which looks amazing, by the way. The transfer looks so good. I was just blown away by how great this colorful, vivid movie looks. But there's an interview on here with science fiction and fantasy writer Ruthanna Emeries, where she talks a lot about Lovecraft and how he had a real fear of small town people. He believed that they were uneducated, that there was unclean breeding among them, and he was terrified. One thing Lovecraft is kind of famous for nowadays is a lot of small-minded, bigoted ideas that he had. But I felt like that came across in this movie, where the townspeople were almost like as scary as Wilbur, who is our occult ritualist, who we're rooting for Sandra Dee to be able to escape from. But they both come across as scary and opposing, and you almost don't know where your allegiances lie at some point. I also just love that our spooky dude is named Wilbur. Kind of reminds me of how in Reanimator, our scary guy is named Herbert. These Lovecraft's naming his villains stuff like Wilbur and Herbert. I find that's just lots of fun. But to mention other cast members in this movie, yeah, you've got Sandra Dee in here, who, of course, I primarily know her as Gidget. I mean, she was a huge teen star in the 50s and 60s. Gidget was a massive hit for teen audiences. This is actually credited as her first adult role. When her contract had ended with Universal, she was finally done playing teenagers. And watching the movie, I kind of wondered how she felt about this movie. Did she think this was some trashy horror film she had to slum it in? But no, she was glad to be able to escape that child image that she had, do something more adult. And she's talked about how when she read this script, she felt like she couldn't put it down. And it was so different from drudging through the bad teen movie scripts that she had been reading up to that point. So she was actually really happy to do this movie. Only thing she wasn't happy to do was be nude in the occult ritual that everything leads up to.
And they placed the girl's virginal body upon the altar, naked to the elements.
And then when we get there, she's not naked. I would have been surprised if Sandra Dee had a nude scene in this movie, but maybe you should have cut the dialogue about how she's supposed to be nude, because that didn't really make sense. Ed Begley is in this movie, as well as Dr. Armitage. He's probably the most famous for being one of the angry men in 12 Angry Men, very legendary movie. And this was actually his last movie. He died like 3 months after making this, or after it was released, maybe. As long as I just mentioned the ritual, that's another thing I loved about this movie. I just loved these occult rituals in horror movies, and I thought this was a really good one. Very atmospheric. The place where it takes place is really cool. And everything about it felt so specific. It didn't feel like this generic satanic ritual that horror movie writers just kind of threw together. Like, it just felt so unique. And like, I do wonder how much real stuff, or maybe just how much Necronomicon stuff that H.P. Lovecraft made up, they really drew from for this, because it just felt really authentic for something that's of course not real. And that's a pretty cool thing to pull off. Very cool ritual in this. If I have to say anything I don't like about this movie, I wouldn't say it's what I don't like, but what I can recognize doesn't work. And is that the movie doesn't always do a great job of dramatizing its concepts. It is limited by the effects of the time. It has a lot of psychedelic sequences, and when it finds ways to visualize the old ones or give the old ones action in the film, it does some creative stuff. It's not just a bunch of tentacles. You know, a lot of people think just tentacles is all Lovecraft is. Everything's got to have tentacles. There's no tentacles in this movie, okay? That's not all what the Lovecraft is about. But they do find some kind of interesting ways to visualize them and have them be this disembodied energy that attacks people, which is an interesting way to go. I don't think it's always great in the execution or always the most exciting thing. The movie also has this concept that Wilbur has a twin, which is not really a spoiler. It's a tagline of the movie that you can see right there. A few years ago in Dunwich, a half-witted girl bore illegitimate twins. One of them was almost human. I really don't think they found a good thing to do with that twin, because like the whole movie you're wondering, how is this twin going to come in? What's going to happen with that? And it kind of ends up being this really quick thing that you kind of see, and it is an interesting image very briefly, and then there's just a quick line to kind of explain it. They don't do a lot with the whole twin concept, and it feels a little throwaway or like they just couldn't quite crack it. But as a Lovecraft adaptation, I think it's one of my favorites at this point. Probably not top 3, maybe I don't know, probably maybe low top 5 maybe. So let's go ahead and rate the Dunwich Horror. Now for atmosphere, I'm going to give this an 8. Now the whole thing looks fantastic, especially on this Blu-ray. I mean, just so vivid. But I just love the look of movies from the late 60s, early 70s. It was such a great period for film. You know, for a lot of it, it does look like, you know, fairly normal 1960s modern day set places. But when they go to Dunwich, they go to his mansion. I don't know if I want to say it a castle, but Wilbur's mansion. Really cool imagery and vibe in there. And the actual location of the ritual looks really cool. Now for characters, I'm going to give this a 6. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I did really like Wilbur's character. I thought he was really interesting. Sandra Dee's character is very standard. She is just kind of our girl, our pure woman who we're supposed to want to come out on the other side of this terrible situation, but she doesn't really do anything for herself to get her out of this situation. She doesn't really have a lot of interesting character traits. You can feel this isn't really what Sandra Dee does best, but I definitely think she tries. I'm really glad she was passionate about doing this movie. I think that was really cool, but not an amazing character. Dr. Armitage is good. You know, it's good to see Ed Begley, but it's not an amazing character piece movie. I'm going to give it a 6, but for story, I'm going to give this an 8 because I think that's where this movie shines much more. Fascinated by the story of this thing, even when it's slow, even when a lot of people would think it's boring. I was just always really interested on seeing this kind of thing unfold and hearing these concepts. Now for scares, I'm going to give this a 6, and it's as high as it is because of the concepts, the horror concepts of the old ones and all that kind of stuff, and the ritual just being such a cool sequence. But I never found the movie scary, and I thought a lot of the horror that they were trying to dramatize in this movie didn't totally work. But anyway, that averages out perfectly to a 7 overall. I thought the Dunwich Horror was a really cool Lovecraft film, and I really do recommend it on this Arrow Video Blu-ray. So that's my thoughts, but I want to know yours. Have you seen this movie? Let me know into what you think down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, check out this video right over here, as well as this playlist that goes over all of my vintage horror reviews. Lots of cool stuff in there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. With all that said, don't forget to enjoy yourself today, have some fun, and I'll see you next time.